Good evening. I'm Patricia Van Skyke, Director of the Lloyd Library and Museum, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's program, Floral Empires, Plant Hunting and Painting in Victorian Britain. The Lloyd Library is well known for its extensive collection of botanical art. Although the Lloyd Library was established as a nature and plant-based science and medical research library, many of the works in our collection come from a time when there was less of a separation between science and art. In addition to hosting a wide range of researchers who use our library, the Lloyd also awards fellowships each year to encourage scholars to dig into our resources and share what they find with a larger academic community. We've awarded history fellowships and artists in residence, but Lindsay Wells is the first art historian to be awarded a Curtis Gates Lloyd Fellowship. Given the nature of our collections and the intersection of Lindsay's work with social and economic constructs, her work here was a perfect fit. As you will see tonight, she brings an original perspective. Lindsay Wells is a historian of 19th century British art and visual culture of plants and gardens. As a current NEH Postdoctoral Fellow at the Getty Research Institute, Lindsay is working on her first book manuscript, Evergreen Empire, Plants, Power and Race, and Pre-Raphaelite and Aesthetic Art. Lindsay received her PhD in art history from the University of Madison in Wisconsin, and recently completed a postdoctoral fellowship at UCLA. Her essays on plants and gardens have appeared in journals including Victorian Studies, Victorian Periodicals Review, and Victorian Literature and Culture. In addition to her recent fellowship at the Lloyd Library, Lindsay's received support from her research at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Oak Spring Garden Foundation, the Winter Thur Museum, the Huntington Library, and the Delaware Art Museum. Please join me in welcoming Lindsay Wells as we learn about her discoveries in plant hunting and art in Victorian Britain. Hi, Lindsay.
Great. Hi, Patricia. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, and good evening to everyone else. I'm so excited to be with you here tonight. And I'm just going to go ahead and start sharing my screen before I jump into my talk. So we'll let it queue up there. All right. And again, Erin and Patricia, if at any point you lose me, jump in and say we've got a technical problem. But with that, again, hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay Wells, and I'm delighted to be speaking with you today about my recent research at the Lloyd Library and Museum, where I had the pleasure of spending several weeks this past July as a 2022 Curtis Gates Lloyd Fellow. During my visit to Cincinnati and my time at the Lloyd's impressive collections, I began to work on a new chapter for my first book, which examines the representation of flowers and other ornamental plants in 19th century British art. I'm an art historian by training, but a large part of my scholarly work focuses on the history of gardening, specifically the gardens of Victorian Britain and the diverse plant life that these spaces were engineered to grow. From orchids and azaleas to palm trees and passionflowers, camellias and fuchsias to cacti and chrysanthemums, thousands of new plants entered British gardens from abroad during this period. And my talk tonight is going to explore the impact of these botanical introductions on not only the evolution of Victorian horticulture, but also that of Victorian painting. And with that, I will jump right into my talk. Before we turn to the British art world, I want to set the stage for my presentation with the following quote from Joseph Harrison, who was a professional flower breeder that worked at a plant nursery in Norfolk during the early decades of the 19th century. And the quote is, "During the past year, the taste for gardening has made rapid advances, and the very extensive circulation of monthly periodicals on floriculture as well as other works on gardening, have very considerably increased the stimulus to these delightful pursuits. Printed just 1 year after Queen Victoria ascended the British throne, Harrison's remarks appeared in the preface to the January 1838 issue of his own monthly periodical, the Floricultural Cabinet and Florist magazine, which he had founded 5 years earlier. Though horticultural literature was by no means a new genre in British writing, it wasn't until the 19th century that journals specializing in this topic began to be widely published. Many scholars have identified the Gardener's Magazine, which appeared in 1826, as the first British periodical devoted solely to horticulture, though dozens of additional titles quickly followed in its wake. Some of these, such as the Magazine of Botany and Gardening, focused on sharing both horticultural and scientific information about plants, while others, like the Gardener and Practical Florist, offered advice on garden layouts, planting schemes, and flower breeding. As Harrison suggests, such texts made domestic gardening more accessible to the British public than ever before. And I knew going into my stay at the Lloyd that I wanted to focus on the horticultural press, these magazines, pamphlets, newspapers, and other mass media outlets where everyday people could have learned about ornamental plants throughout the 19th century. One reason why I knew I wanted to work with this material was because of the innovative use of images in many Victorian horticulturalists embraced in their work. As the British gardener and glasshouse architect Joseph Paxton observed in 1834, during the last year, nearly 200 new introductions have been figured by the various botanical periodicals in course of publication, some of which are exceedingly beautiful. Unlike many texts of the 18th century, 19th century gardening books and journals were often lavishly illustrated with lithographs, woodcuts, etchings, and other types of prints, sometimes with the addition of hand-colored details or printed on large sheets of folded paper. While many of these images serve the practical function of illustration, I also wanted to approach them as performing their own kind of rhetorical work in terms of helping readers visualize plants that they might have been unfamiliar with or that were coming into Britain from faraway places. Not only did the horticultural press play a key role in popularizing different methods of gardening in the 19th century, but it also operated as an influential source of both textual and visual information about plants from within and beyond the borders of the British Empire. According to some estimates, the number of cultivated plants in Europe increased from approximately 500 in the 16th century to 18,000 by the 1830s, an international phenomenon that was deeply rooted in the rise of modern imperialism. "What a field," wrote one garden writer in 1853, "we have opening before us in those almost hermetically sealed countries, Japan and China, whilst Oregon, the Brazils, and other countries are undergoing a more rigid scrutiny, so that we may expect an immense accession to the beautiful plants already received from those parts." This passage brings the imperial aspirations of Victorian horticulture into sharp focus, and it reminds us why these larger histories of travel, trade, and empire building must be brought to bear on works of art that feature the spoils of European plant hunting. While previous scholarship has identified the garden as an important symbolic device in Victorian painting, much remains to be said about the cosmopolitan flora that it typically contained. Given the popularity of horticulture at this time, it is not surprising that both gardens and garden flowers can be found in nearly every genre of Victorian art. Portraits, history paintings, still lifes, landscapes are all filled with images of people either tending or enjoying cultivated spaces. Invested with a wide range of symbolic meanings, the garden served as a rich pictorial emblem of religious faith, moral purity, gender roles, and even political order throughout the 19th century. In the rest of my time, however, I'd like to examine these painted gardens alongside the broader history of British plant hunting, or the practice by which both private and state-sponsored institutions collected plants from around the world in the 19th century. What can we learn about the imperial significance of the gardens and flowers in Victorian art if we place them into dialogue with horticultural literature from the same period? This was one of the questions I had in mind when I began my research at the Lloyd Library. And to begin answering it tonight, I want to first turn to some of the advances in garden technology that transformed the horticultural landscape of 19th century Britain. A beloved recreational pastime across every social class, gardening took many different shapes in Victorian culture. While large aristocratic landscape gardens had dominated Britain during the 18th century, these were gradually eclipsed by a more varied and intimate array of styles and designs as time went on. Some people embraced the rustic aesthetic of cottage and wild gardening, for example, which favored old-fashioned plants and naturalistic landscaping, while others orchestrated florist flowers into elaborate displays of color and texture. Indoor gardening also came into vogue in the 19th century, in part because conservatories, terrariums, and window gardens were extremely effective at protecting plants from smoky air. And I think it's important to remember here that the 19th century is also, of course, this time of very rapid and widespread industrialization. So if you lived in a city at that time and you wanted to grow plants, you really had to think about how coal and other fossil fuels being burned en masse were affecting the atmosphere. And that's one of the reasons why keeping plants behind glass became so popular, because it just let them grow a lot better than out in the open air. And following the repeal of the glass tax in 1845, it became cheaper than ever before to build these specialized structures for growing different plants. And soon this became one of the most common modes of gardening in Victorian Britain. In England, wrote one observer in 1875, nearly everyone has either its window garden or its greenhouse, and scarcely any family of intelligence but knows something of culture and propagation of plants. While growing plants on windowsills or throughout the home remains a popular activity to the present day, such displays were still relatively new at the beginning of the 19th century. As time progressed, however, indoor gardening was cast as one of the easiest and most affordable methods of gardening that one could undertake. As the magazine The British Florist explained in 1840, the pleasures derived from flowers may be enjoyed by everyone, from the wealthiest owner of the stove, the conservatory, and the parterre, down to the humble possessor of the smallest patch of ground, or even of a single flower pot in the window. Another reason why the conservatory and window garden in particular became so popular was because they allowed people to curate valuable collections of foreign plants, the most fashionable of which at this time came from Africa, Asia, the Americas, and other regions of British colonial activity. As early as 1817, garden writer John Claudius Loudon attributed the rising popularity of glasshouses in Britain to the increasing taste for exotic botany and more general demand for the culinary luxuries of hothouses. A robust market for imported plants continued to flourish as the 19th century progressed, with the author of one gardening pamphlet I came across at the Lloyd boasting in 1881 that innumerable new varieties and species of plants have been introduced, To name no others, we have the annuals of California and the flowering shrubs of Japan, the heliotrope of Peru, the fuchsia of Chile, and the dahlia of Mexico. Ironically titled The English Flower Garden, this particular pamphlet discloses just how international British horticulture had grown by the final decades of the 19th century. The geographical diversity of Victorian gardens was indeed vast, and a sense of this can be gleaned by looking at the illustrations in seed catalogs, gardening handbooks, and horticultural newspapers, a very large collection of which are housed at the Lloyd. Consider, for instance, the 1837 frontispiece to the Floral Cabinet and Magazine of Exotic Botany, ringed with an array of potted orchids from the Western Hemisphere. Or take the colored prints of Chinese primroses, Japanese anemones, and American rhododendrons featured in the book Choice Garden Flowers from 1860. I'd also like to draw special attention to this colorful lithograph of a window garden that appeared in an 1877 article for the Floral World and Garden Guide, a British periodical that specialized in advice for amateur gardeners. In the foreground of this picture, we see a tiled window box overflowing with lush blossoms, among which appear to be the distinctively patterned leaves of a tropical begonia. To the left, we can see the foliage of another tropical plant, the coleus, while creeping vines of South American passionflowers lead our eye up a wire trellis. At the center of this picture stands a tall lily, the gold speckled petals of which suggest that we may be looking at a Lilium auratum, a Japanese lily that became extremely popular in Britain after its 1862 introduction by the nurseryman and plant hunter John Vetch. Described decades later in a British seed catalog as the queen of lilies, Lilium auratum was but one of thousands of flowers that found their way into Victorian gardens through commercial nurseries, which played an important part in not only funding plant expeditions around the world, but also in marketing new plants to the British public. During the 19th century, the geographical origins of different plants was a major selling point for the ornamental plant industry, an especially vivid example of which we can see here in an 1872 catalog from the London nurseryman William Bull, who advertised that his nursery firm sold beautiful plants which are perfectly new to this country, comprising introductions from Madagascar, Peru, Java, Philippine Islands, New Caledonia, St. Catharines, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Para, Natal, Japan, Ascension, South Sea, and Fiji Islands, et cetera, et cetera. So assuming even a broader selection than he's advertising here. So such catalogs provided a direct link between Victorian consumers and professional plant hunters, though they were by no means the only channel through which British gardeners at this time could learn about foreign flora. One could also look, for example, to illustrated gardening books, plant journals, or horticultural newspapers, which also had a very wide circulation at this time. Here I'm showing just a handful examples of items I consulted at the Lloyd Library. And I've selected these specific images because each of them depict a plant that can also be found in this mid-19th century oil painting called Convent Thoughts by the artist Charles Alston Collins. And if that name sounds a little bit familiar to you, Charles Alston Collins, and if there's any Victorian literature buffs in the audience, Charles Alston Collins was the brother of the novelist Wilkie Collins, who in the 19th century published the very successful novels, The Woman in White and The Moonstone. So painted, back to our painting here, painted in an Oxfordshire garden during the summer of 1850, and exhibited the following year at the Royal Academy in London. Convent Thoughts is perhaps one of the most famous examples today of what's known as Pre-Raphaelite art. Established in 1848, The British Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was a group of painters, writers, and sculptors who aimed at forging a new mode of art making grounded in emotional sincerity and observational rigor. To that end, its founding members abandoned the compositional principles and formulas prescribed by the Royal Academy in favor of more detailed imagery studied straight from life. And I have up here on the screen an engraving after probably one of the most famous Pre-Raphaelite pictures that some of you might be familiar with, John Everett Millet's 1852 painting Ophelia. So back to this idea of the Pre-Raphaelites wanting to study nature straight from life in order to, convey that more convincingly in their art. This belief that artists needed to study nature firsthand in order to effectively translate it into art was especially important to the Pre-Raphaelite project. And one could argue that it underpins much of the distinctive floral imagery we find in this British art movement. Outdoor sketching in particular was essential to the Pre-Raphaelite program, as can be seen from the fastidious botanical imagery we see throughout Collins's picture. For many Pre-Raphaelites, it was important to paint actual flowers from life as opposed to just generalized floral motifs. And a composition like Convent Thoughts shows how these artists filled their work with details that conveyed the unique individuality of different plants. The torn petals of the flowers and the yellowing edges of the lily pads in the foreground, for example, seem to announce to the viewer that this painting is representing actual plants that were once growing in real life. Elsewhere in the work, we see small dewdrops and granules of pollen lying on the Madonna lilies along the left side of the picture. Their petals sculpted into these sort of cups of green and pink and white pigment. We can also see hundreds of tiny brushstrokes denoting every blade of grass in the background, while the sharp edges are used throughout the picture to clearly define the shape of growing plants. A picture that rewards close looking and prolonged meditation. Convent Thoughts turns its flower garden setting into a sort of visual statement about Pre-Raphaelite design principles, particularly this mandate to paint nature directly from the motif. It's the kind of painting that no matter how many times you see it, you'll almost always find something that you previously overlooked. And just as a quick example of what I mean by this, I've viewed this painting, I think, about 3 times in person, where it's housed at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And it was only in writing this talk over the past couple of weeks that I noticed for the first time the little tadpole swimming in a puddle of water on one of the lily pads. So all that to say, it's a painting that I think there's a lot to be said about it. There's a lot of details to unpack, and also a lot of different registers of meaning going on here. And while this work clearly reflects the importance of nature to Pre-Raphaelite painting, I think it also highlights the movement's self-conscious embrace of medieval and Renaissance art very well as well. As their name suggests, the Pre-Raphaelites drew compositional inspiration from earlier artistic epochs, in part out of the belief that painters from these times enjoyed a more direct and therefore less mediated relationship with their subjects than later generations who were thought to have simply recycled the conventions of high Renaissance art, like the work of Raphael. Taking inspiration from medieval manuscripts, early Italian frescoes, and Northern Renaissance prints, Pre-Raphaelite art can often be identified by its use of bright colors and shallow backgrounds, both of which we can see here in the embowered courtyard of Convent Thoughts. This hortus conclusus, or enclosed garden, in which the picture is set, also harkens back to medieval art and literature, where such spaces were often used as emblems of the Virgin Mary and metaphors for purity and chastity. Religion is certainly a prominent theme at play in this painting, which features numerous references to spirituality and devotion. Besides the nun standing at the center of the picture, we see her holding in one hand an illuminated manuscript depicting the crucifixion, while in the other, she raises a small passion flower to her lowered eyes. And I'm going to talk about this in a little more detail in a moment, but the passion flower by this point was also considered a Christian symbol of Christ's passion. While the surrounding garden can also be read through a symbolic religious lens, its designs and content enjoy an equally close relationship to 19th century horticulture. Not only does convent thought speak to the importance of nature painting to pre-Raphaelite art, but it also parallels the wider use of the garden in Victorian visual culture as a symbol of femininity. By 1851, over half of Britain's once rural population had moved from the countryside into towns and cities, which in turn prompted a rise in suburban gardens, much like the Oxford garden I mentioned a little earlier, where we know Collins painted the background of convent thoughts. Because of its close proximity to the home, private gardens were often touted as these respectable leisure spaces for Victorian women, who society at the time expected to confine their interests mainly to domestic matters. Bearing this ideological function of horticulture in mind, one might compare convent thoughts to a work like the German artist Edward Gärtner's Family of Mr. Westphal in the Conservatory, a group portrait that uses a more modern garden structure to build its own image of idealized womanhood. At first glance, Collins and Gärtner seem to be exploring very different areas of ornamental gardening. Yet when we consider how these works both incorporate non-European plants into their design, a number of similarities begin to emerge between the two. For example, the lush setting of each painting captures the sheer variety of foreign plants that European consumers could purchase by the first half of the 19th century, like the cacti and amaryllises we see lining the back wall in the Gärtner Conservatory. These botanical details lend textured passages of color to the composition, while also binding the four pictured figures into a tight-knit group. Like the garden wall in Convent Thoughts, this glasshouse forges a literal closeness between floral commodities from around the world and a well-to-do European family, reflecting in the process how gardens can generate not only social messages, but also narratives about things like imperial expansion. I would argue that a comparable dynamic is at play in Convent Thoughts. Filled with ornamental plants from Africa, the Mediterranean, and North and South America, Convent Thoughts discloses, in the same spirit as the Gärtner portrait, just how dramatically the geographical borders of British gardens had expanded by the mid-19th century. Some of the flowers we find in the foreground here include North American honeysuckles, an African agapanthus, and Turk's cap lilies, three plants that entered Britain from abroad in 1656, 1692, and 1738, respectively. While such flowers may have been chosen for purely symbolic or decorative reasons, they nevertheless disclose traces of the imperial activities that brought certain flowers to the forefront of the Victorian imagination. Of all the plants featured in this painting, however, the tropical passion flower that lies at its heart offers us perhaps the most overt example of a floral import. With its slender white petals ringed by blue and red filaments, this blossom closely resembles the common blue passion flower, or Passiflora caerulea. A semi-evergreen vine that grows throughout South America, the blue passion flower was one of the first members of its botanical family to enter Europe during the 17th century, first via Spain and Italy through Jesuit missionaries who adopted the flower as a Christian emblem of the crucifixion, and later into Britain through Mary Somerset, the first Duchess of Beaufort. It is from this point onward that we begin to find passion flowers in works of European art, such as this 18th century still life by the Dutch artist Margaretha Haverman, who pictured the blossom alongside other popular garden plants. By the 19th century, passion flowers could also be found in advertisements, greeting cards, works of decorative art, though arguably one of the largest producers of images of this plant was the horticultural press. With its extensive collection of gardening books and periodicals, the Lloyd Library is uniquely positioned to chronicle the history of the passion flower, as it took root in not only the gardens of Victorian Britain, but also in Victorian visual culture. Many 19th century garden writers claimed that the passion flower first arrived in Britain around 1629, when the horticulturalist John Parkinson featured the plant in the first edition of his treatise Paradisian Sol Paradisus Terrestris. In this book, Parkinson offered readers two different representations of the passion flower, one that illustrated the plant's appropriation as a symbol of Christ's passion, and a second, more naturalistic image that placed it into the company of other garden flowers. This early modern cultivation history of the passion flower was frequently repeated in later British gardening texts, including the first volume of William Curtis's Botanical Magazine, a periodical founded in 1787 that remains in publication to this very day. And here I'm going to read the entry that Curtis provides in the Botanical Magazine on the passion flower. So the passion flower, we read, first introduced into this country was a native of Virginia and figured by Parkinson in his Paradisus Terrestris, who there styles it the surpassing delight of all flowers. The present species, which from its great beauty and superior hardiness is now by far the most common, is of more modern introduction, and though a native of the Brazils, seldom suffers from the severity of our climate, flowering plentifully during most of the summer months, if trained to a wall with a southern aspect. As this entry makes clear, the passion flower was prized for both its visual appeal and practical adaptability, with the blue passion flower remaining popular in Britain well into the Victorian period, in part because this was one of the few varieties of the plant that could grow outside of a greenhouse. A few decades after Collins painted Convent Thoughts, for example, garden writer Shirley Hibbard would describe the Passiflora caerulea as both the hardiest and best known flower, a variety of the plant in cultivation. Dozens of additional passion flowers continued to arrive from South and Central America during the first half of the 19th century, with one periodical estimating in 1846 that there were, quote, upwards of 100 species and varieties, end quote. To share just a few examples I came across in my research, we have the Passiflora suberosa from James Edward Smith's Handbook on Exotic Botany, the Passiflora palmata from Conrad Ladegase's Botanical Cabinet, the Passiflora belloti from the Gardener's Magazine of Botany, the Buchanan passion flower in Hibbard's Floral World and Garden Guide, and the Passiflora Kermesina from the Floral Cabinet and Magazine of Exotic Botany. It's a lot of passion flower names, but I did that to myself. And I did that in part because such images, they lend credence to this 19th century claim about the immense popularity of passion flowers, as when one journalist called them in 1837, quote, the most graceful ornament to the hot stove, end quote. But I also bring up so many examples to show just how unceasing Britain's search for new passion flowers was throughout the Victorian period. By the time the Pre-Raphaelites gained a foothold in the British art world, imperial expansion had transformed the nation's ornamental plant trade into a lucrative industry. Nursery gardens and seed shops of the 18th century had long since evolved into major commercial enterprises, with the firms of Conrad Ladegase, James Vetch, William Bull, Benjamin Samuel Williams, and other urban nurserymen joining large botanic gardens like Kew in overseeing this mass influx of foreign plants. In 1858, a contributor to the journal The Florist, Fruitist, and Garden Miscellany attributed the global scope of modern British horticulture to a combination of professional plant hunting and domestic gardening, explaining how the mountains of the Caucasus, the hedges of the Isles of Bourbon, or the plains of China have all been ransacked for the rose. The camellia has come from the far-off Isles of Japan, the pine from the West Indies. And how comes it then that these are now within the reach of so many? Entirely owing to the taste for gardening. Declarations about the geographical breadth of British gardening can be found throughout the Victorian horticultural press. And bearing such passages in mind, we might read pictures like convent thoughts as mediums through which the vast botanical geographies of empire were made readily visible. What I'm sharing with you today is a small piece of a much larger book project that investigates how paintings, drawings, and other examples of fine and decorative art worked alongside the representations of plants in garden writing to shape narratives about empire in Victorian Britain. Drawing together the histories of art, gardening, and botany, my research at the Lloyd Library revolved around two main questions. How does art influence our perception of nature? And what can the visual culture of plants reveal about hierarchies of power? What I hope I've shown today is why botanical imagery is essential to understanding how one of the most influential Victorian art movements evolved in tandem with British imperialism. I'm incredibly grateful to everyone at the Lloyd Library for supporting my work on this project. And for the sake of time, I'm going to end here and turn it back to Patricia and her colleagues for the Q&A. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Lindsay. That was fascinating. Oh, am I muted still?
Oh, no, I can hear you just fine.
All right. Yeah, that was, and one of the things that I enjoyed so much learning from you was about the passion flowers. So I really love that you ended on that note. I was not aware that it was a Christian emblem. I always thought that the passion flower was not at all religious in nature. So again, really, thank you so much for putting things into context. I don't have any questions yet that have popped up, so I'm going to shoot a few at you if that's all right. So first of all, you mentioned really early in your program about around 1853, one of the authors talking about taking plant hunting under scrutiny. And you know, one of the things that I'm aware of as a gardener and just somebody that's interested in nature is how much over the past 30 or 40 years we have such an awareness of the damage that's really comes about from invasive trees and invasive plants and that sort of thing. And I think what you've shown us sort of starts to lay the groundwork, if you will, for a situation that would get very out of control. Did you see any concerns in the Victorian? Did the Victorians have a clue that this might create havoc later down the road?
Yeah, I think that's thank you, Patricia. That's a really great question. And I guess the short answer would be yes. Questions about invasive species definitely start getting talked about in the 19th century. Of course, a lot of plants that today might get classified as invasive species were traveling through these horticultural networks and may have initially been brought somewhere intended to be an ornamental plant and then escaped the garden, so to speak. But in terms of like broader concerns about the environment we sometimes find in garden writing. Two that spring to mind right away is, it's interesting with plant hunting because, of course, for a lot of these plants, a plant hunter wasn't necessarily bringing back thousands of one type of flower to then sell in their nursery garden. They would maybe bring back one sample of the flower, then breed their own hundreds of that flower in their glass houses. But there are a couple plants where there were definitely concerns about sort of taking too many out of nature. And those two were probably two of the most popular decorative plants in the 19th century, the fern and the orchid. So you definitely see things about concerns. Devonshire in England was a very popular site for fern hunting in the 19th century. So there were lots of concerns about local fern populations sort of being depleted through this sort of sort of frenzied collecting of ferns. And that same worry about, are we destroying local plant populations? It comes up quite a bit when talking about orchids, fears that, we're taking so many out of their natural habitats, there's not going to be any left for future generations to go and find. So there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, it's obviously, a much more complicated issue than I think a lot of those writers at the time realized, but it does come up quite a bit. So.
We have somebody, Jacob, has asked, was conservatory gardening a female forward art or was it more male dominated? Also, did you ever come across a dogwood as a passion flower? And a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for your question, Jacob. Real quick, I haven't found any connections where comparing sort of dogwoods and passion flowers. I mean, I guess the flowers themselves, they do look kind of similar, but I would keep an eye out for that because I love dogwoods. So I like that question. But as to your other question about, was conservatory gardening branded as, a feminine activity? I think it's a more complicated answer than a lot of historians than it comes across in a lot of like scholarship on gardening, because it definitely was sort of marketed as this, respectable leisure activity for women to engage in because it's attached to the home. It's about making your home beautiful. This, of course, is when gender roles are very rigidly defined in Victorian society. So certainly, garden writers specifically marketed indoor gardening to women. But at the same time, I've come across just so many examples, including images of men who were also very engaged in indoor gardening. So I think it was practiced sort of across society a lot more evenly than maybe it might initially seem when we're sort of only looking at the images of women in glass houses. But both people, men and women, were both participating in the activity, but it was definitely presented as a specifically, appropriate activity for women at the time.
We have another question. Again, thanking you for the very interesting talk. You've done a wonderful job visualizing plants. I know you are more interested in floral gardening, but is there evidence to a parallel increase seen in growing fruit varieties?
Yes, absolutely. I think for the sake of my sanity and for ever publishing this book, I decided to only focus on flowers, but produce cultivation also experienced this sort of big increase in the 19th century. I had that one tiny quote from John Claudius Loudon where he talked about, gardeners being obsessed with exotic botany, his quote, and then also the luxuries of the hothouses, culinary luxuries of the hothouses. So I'm taking that to mean, things like grapes or pineapples that would have been grown beneath glass. The orangery is actually the earliest known type of what we would think of as like a greenhouse that comes into Britain during the early modern period. So growing fruit, honestly, I think that happened before growing flowers beneath glass in British culture. And definitely throughout the 19th century, there's also a lot of advances in plant breeding. So you get tons of new varieties of things like apples and stone fruits and grapes. So it's, you know, they're definitely happening in parallel with one another. And I think what's really interesting is that, you know, Patricia mentioned in her introduction, you know, a lot of these gardening journals, as I'm calling them, also had a lot of scientific information in them. There also was less of a distinction between, say, horticulture and agriculture in a lot of this media. But by the 19th century, we see these different disciplines sort of teasing out into their own streams. And so journals tend to become more specialized as the 19th century progresses. And so agriculture starts going into its own periodicals, flower gardening into its own. But really good question.
So I have another question that I will ask you. So you definitely taught me to take a really closer look at art, especially when it comes to plants and gardening and what some of the messaging is behind it and what you see captured in the painting or the work of art or the magazines or the books. Is there anything, can you share with us something that caught you by surprise when you were looking through either at the Lloyd or someplace else? It doesn't, I mean, if Lloyd, that would be great, but you know, where you're like, oh my gosh, what's that in there?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing is that, you know, I was just starting my talk is sort of coming from a chapter of my book, and I was just starting to work on it over the summer when I was visiting. And at the time, I wasn't sure if passion flowers were really going to be the star of my discussion of that painting, because there's a lot of other plants and a lot of routes I could have gone down. But it's interesting, every time I take a research trip, I think I end up noticing different things based on the research questions I bring to the table with me at that time. And, you know, for whatever reason, I kind of within my first week there, you know, passion flower kept coming up way more frequently than I had ever remembered noticing it in visiting other collections. And so as then I started to read the discourse surrounding it, you know, it had this long early modern cultivation history in Britain. I thought it was very interesting how consistently Victorian garden writers are sort of citing 17th and 18th century garden writers. So you can kind of see this emergence of this historiographical tradition of how garden history is being told and recounted. And what's really interesting is that there are a lot of books published today sort of by plant scientists for the general reader, you know, the history of the camellia, the history of the, you know, azalea or rhododendron or something. And it's fascinating just how frequently these 19th century gardening texts are sometimes cited as sources of authority on when certain plants entered Britain. And it was interesting to see the Victorian artists sort of doing, or Victorian writers doing that as well, sort of looking at books that are very old for them, even in the 19th century, you know, a book from the 1600s is quite old for them, but taking it as sort of this source of authoritative information. So that was one surprise. Another was just, I felt like I paid a lot more attention this time to, there are just so many illustrations in 19th century gardening periodicals. And it's something, I didn't have this line in my talk, I think I took it out when editing it, but something I find really interesting about garden writing at this time was how visual horticulture becomes in the 19th century. And what I mean by that is, like, you know, when you compare a journal published around the 1820s to one from the 1890s, it's like night and day in terms of the number of pictures. It's just so many more images get incorporated into later publications. And I also think it's interesting how these illustrations, you know, many of the pictures of plants I showed, they're clearly drawing on the conventions of scientific illustration, in terms of making sure you show all the different sides of the plants or their seeds, but they're playing with those conventions too. Like I see elements of still life, floral still life coming into it, or genre scenes when they show the little people interacting with their gardens. So I'm just interested too, as a category of images, how garden illustrations, they sort of walk that line between, functional illustration and something we would maybe categorize more like art. So yeah, thank you for your question, Patricia.
So we have a couple more comments. We have Connie saying that the dogwood is also associated with crucifixion story.
Oh, okay, got
it. That the wood was used to make the cross, and the 4 petals of the flowers were compared to the shapes of the cross and the 4 corners of the world. Oh
my gosh, Connie, thank you. That is all new to me. I'm going to be on the lookout for, I'd be interested, like when, I'd be interested if people draw those connections. I'm sure they do. Maybe I've even come across them and just missed them, but thank you so much.
And then Robert says that Darwin was very interested and wrote on orchids and insectivorous plants.
Yeah. Okay. One interesting little side note about Darwin's work with orchids, of course, he was using them as sort of an example to sort of prove his theories of natural and sexual selection. And something I learned really interesting in the course of my research is he was had a professional working relationship with several London nurserymen who would help him source orchids for his research, because of course these are very expensive plants back then, kind of like they still are today. So that I thought was interesting, is Darwin was definitely familiar with what was going on in the gardening world of his era.
Well, the questions are really rolling in now. Charles says, perhaps I missed this in the introduction, but I wonder how much knowledge awareness you had prior to beginning your study about where plants originated and how various species are spread around the world.
Yeah, I mean, so my route into sort of studying garden history was a little bit roundabout, because I did my undergrad and master's all in art history, and at the time I was mostly working on landscape painting. I then quickly realized I've always been more interested in the plants in a landscape than in like the genre of landscape. So it was at the beginning of my doctoral studies that I started to do a little bit more research on gardening, and was really interested just, how much gardening technology becomes invented and popularized in the 19th century. So things like what we think of today as greenhouses and glasshouses, the terrarium is invented in the 19th century. So it was really learning about these different methods and structures of gardening. I started to learn what were they used for. So, a lot of the actual history, the cultivation history and sort of the global circulations of plants, it's something that's, I was not familiar with until I started my doctoral work. But now it's, I sometimes have to remind myself I'm an art historian, and to bring it back to the art, because I just find it so fascinating. And I think that, I like to say we need more people working on plants, because there are millions of them, and it would be impossible for, any one book or article to ever tell each of their stories. And I just think there's so many fascinating histories still to uncover about different plants. So thanks so much for your comment.
So Valerie says, oh, wait, there's something. We'll jump to Valerie, and then we have another comment. Said, have you studied any other mediums depicting floral art, documenting like stonework or glass or stained glass? And I think pottery, and she adds pottery. Okay, so other mediums.
Yeah, sort of the later chapters of my book are going to be moving a bit more into decorative art. So I have plans to be writing a lot about wallpaper. I think William Morris wallpaper is probably the most, famous example of a Victorian designer who incorporated a lot of different plants into his work, but of course there were a lot others. Pottery is definitely a good example as well. Textiles, fashion, things like, greeting cards have a lot of different flowers used in them. Starting to, in my work here at the Getty, dip my toe a little bit into photography as well and stereoscope prints. So, where do we see, these plants cropping up in like very new visual mediums for the time? And I'm glad you brought up stained glass though, because I didn't get to quite go into too much detail on these pre-Raphaelite artists I was talking about, but quite a few of them also made designs for stained glass, and they're incorporating different flowers into those works. A lot of them are very common, traditional symbolic flowers in Western art, things like roses and lilies, but we do get some more newly introduced flowers to Europe. Things like the sunflower show up in pre-Raphaelite stained glass, and the sunflower comes into Britain around the same time as the passionflower. It's one of those sort of that first wave of plant hunting at the beginning of modern imperialism, and then there's a lot of new plants that then come in the 19th century. But yeah, I think that's a good observation that it's not just painting for sure.
And Valerie adds that X-rays of flowers are amazing.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And there's, again, I always, when I see these, I'm like, maybe I should work on that artist instead. But there are, artists doing experiments with photography at this time, like the photographer Anna Atkins, who worked in cyanotype prints, really interesting things, where you press the flower onto the plate and it leaves an image. I'm probably describing it very poorly because it's not my area of expertise, but yeah, just a lot of really innovative images of flowers too, depending on what you use to document them.
So Elaine has sent a link to a short article about several plants with Christian symbolisms. And so Lindsay, I've copied that link, and I'll email that to you after the program.
Great. I also see Robert brought up the redbud tree. That's,
sure.
I think that's a good point, because I know a more like colloquial name for the redbud tree is the Judas tree. And that's how I see it often identified in 19th century garden writing. So yeah, I mean, I tried to hint at this, that something my project doesn't touch too much on is, the world of floral symbolism. And that of course is super popular in the 19th century. The Victorian language of flowers, I think, is something we still hear about today, and still sort of in different ways remains popular well after the 19th century. So yeah, I think those are all great observations.
So lots of folks thanking you for tonight's talk. I have just two quick questions for you.
Yeah.
Have you become a gardener?
Oh my gosh, unfortunately, I move around so much that like I'm a houseplant gardener, maybe. I know my poor mother, her home is just filled with plants that I've abandoned there over the years as, I'm passing through, moving from one place to another. But I did grow up on a small farm that grew pumpkins and raspberries. So, I think that's where my love of plants initially came from. I do have, aspirations someday when I've got a nice yard and some free time to get more into it. But if one thing I've learned from like reading all these gardening books is like, it's very challenging. And it's actually kind of funny how often Victorian garden writers talk about, how many plants they kill in their efforts to grow them, or like, they'll open their book saying, hey, don't feel bad if you killed all your house plants. I did too, and now I'm going to teach you how to do it right. But yeah, I mean, the other thing I'm always bearing in mind too, though, is, I'm not sure how much of the 19th century advice I'm reading would still hold up as practical. So I would probably have to reteach myself, from more modern sources.
Well, I want to thank you so much for tonight's lecture and placing Victorian gardens in a much wider context for all of us. I'm sure we look forward to seeing your book when it comes out. I'd also like to thank the audience for attending tonight's lecture and point out that programs like these, as well as the fellowship program, which Lindsay was a part of, are supported by Lloyd members. So if you're a Lloyd member, thank you. If you're not, consider joining us.